In our world today, our future is portrayed as hyper-technological. Technology seems to be replacing human labor, human connection, and even human thinking. It's easy to see this in society and assume that we are moving in this direction out of necessity. For some, it's our destiny. It's an inevitability. In truth, it's an obsession. It's a religion. You see, in some circles, technology seems to be taken to the point that artificial intelligence is a representation of God Himself. That through machines, through artificial intelligence, we can communicate with other beings and hidden worlds. That it's machines that break the veil between our world and others. Practices that were once reserved for oak groves, stone circles, and salt rings are now working through man's creation, through synthetic forces. Magic is now in the machine, and there's no going back. In this episode, we are going to pull back the veil and look at the techno-religion that is forming in our world. And we are going to do this through exploring the occult secrets of Mars. We are going to be leaving the physical planet of Mars behind for this chapter a little bit so that we can get to understand the esoteric meaning of Mars or the occult meaning of Mars. If we want to understand occult groups or secret orders, we have to understand the esoteric and occult meaning of the planetary spheres. The reason being is because our soul actually passes through these spheres upon death and rebirth. And this creates a very big effect on our consciousness, life after life on Earth. It's also good to keep in mind that although we do see a lot of technology being used in the occult now, even though we're seeing that, it doesn't negate that even occult technologies or even the spiritual use of technologies or using technologies to summon things or what have you, even in those cases, they're still using the same cosmology that has always existed within the mystery schools. So they're still using occult science or mystery science. They're still using the planets in a certain way. They're still using the elements in a specific way. The only different thing is that they're now just incorporating technology in the dark occult. So just because something seems more innovative, it doesn't mean that they're not using traditional methods. So what does this Mars energy represent? What does the planet Mars represent esoterically? So Mars is obviously representing the masculine forces in the cosmos. And this is why the symbol of male is the Martian symbol. And of course, Venus represents feminine forces, and that represents the female symbol as well. So there's a reason why it is portrayed that way in astrology and in the occult. And in spiritual teachings, Mars has a very specific effect on consciousness. It is usually an activating force. It is forward motion. It is even upward motion. So upward motion, forward motion, the upward direction, the forward direction. And this is why usually you'll see Mars represented as the obelisk, the upward arrow or upward triangle, and also the phallus. In the mystical hymns of Orpheus by Thomas Taylor, Taylor describes Mars in a similar fashion, stating that Mars is the differentiating, individuating, and materializing force for the Earth. He states that Mars is the source of division, motion, separating the contrarieties of the universe, which he also repeatedly excites and immutably preserves. He immutably preserves these in order that the world may be perfect and filled with forms of every kind. In Theosophy, Mars is also revealed to be an individuating force, stating that Mars relates to the centrifugal state wherein the soul becomes a more individuated center of force. So here we understand that Mars forces are responsible for differentiating different impulses from the whole. These impulses can then materialize in various material forms and thus have the opportunity to exist as an individualized aspect of the Godhead. Of course, like any cosmic force, it can manifest in a balanced way or an imbalanced way. For example, the Mars forces within an individual can lead to a powerful sense of individuality and even leadership, as we see in the Ram or Aries character traits. However, this impulse can also become imbalanced in the world and in the individual, causing self-centeredness and also an intense desire to think too materialistically. When someone is trapped in the inverted or lower Mars impulse, the individual or the self can become the most important thing at the expense of the collective, and people who personally align with this impulse can become too egotistical or too self-centered. Thus, the lower inverted forces of Mars are considered destructive because they can lead society into a selfish and materialistic existence. Those possessed by this influence will be a destructive force in the world. If these forces possess humanity for too long, they can lead to the regression of consciousness. Rudolf Steiner provides even more details on humanity's relationship with the red planet when he describes Mars's parallel phases of evolution with our own planet. In his lecture, The Mission of Christian Rosenkreuz, he reveals that it was the Mars forces that led to the extreme, scientific materialist impulse that struck humanity around the end of the Middle Ages. He says that, previously, Mars had sent forth good forces, but now Mars sent forth more and more forces that would have led men deeper and deeper into Maya, or into material illusion. The achievements that were inspired by Mars at that time were ingenious and clever, but they were Maya all the same. So Mars, at that time, at the end of the Middle Ages, sunk so low that its influence on humanity was that many individuals passing through Mars before their incarnation on Earth came into the Earth plane with an extremely materialistic ideology. This materialist Martian ideology then began to spread around the Earth, creating a subculture of intense materialism. It should be noted here that in occult science, our solar system is seen as a school. After death, our soul takes on experiences in other planetary spheres of our solar system. In the Edgar Cayce work, these are called planetary sojourns. The same teaching can also be found in Rudolf Steiner's Anthroposophy and, of course, in ancient Eastern esoterica. All planetary bodies in our solar system function in relation to one another and represent the overall life expression of our fixed star, the Sun. Over time, after various experiences in other spheres, our soul essence moves towards incarnating on the Earth again. The Earth at this time is the most dense material planet. As each planetary sphere is evolving in its own right, it also has a fundamental relationship with the Earth, and these fundamental relationships cause different phases of life or consciousness for humanity. For example, Mars has been in a regressive condition in relation to the Earth. As Steiner mentioned, souls were passing through the Mars sphere before their earthly incarnation, and many of them were taking on backwards, destructive impulses. Thus, in their earthly lives, they were becoming too materialist in their perception and losing sight of the spiritual worlds. They were losing sight of the higher worlds or the spiritual essence within themselves. Due to Mars's imbalanced and dark condition, an evolutionary impulse was introduced. The evolutionary impulse allowed Mars and the souls that would pass through Mars the opportunity to overcome and integrate the malefic forces. However, even though this transcending evolutionary impulse was introduced to Mars, it did not completely delete the previous hypermaterialist impulse. It simply gave souls passing through Mars upon their next incarnation on Earth an opportunity to align with the higher aspect that was now available to them. This means that each soul would have to overcome within their own being the darker Martian impulse. And this is part of the initiation in our solar system school. If they could do that, if they could overcome the regressive Mars aspect in their own being, they would take from Mars the highest it has to offer. Thus, some souls passing through Mars before their earthly incarnation are taking on the regressive Mars impulse, while others are not. Now, why am I explaining these occult secrets about Mars? Well, because understanding this dynamic reveals that some souls on Earth represent Mars in the regressive condition, while others represent Mars's higher evolution. Essentially, there are two streams of consciousness related to Mars that are occupying our planet, one regressive and one progressive. One's relationship to Mars will determine the quality of their consciousness and what they are able to perceive. Specifically, those who have not passed the initiation on Mars will be drawn into materialist ideologies and find it increasingly difficult to connect to spiritual worlds. In this condition, one may become increasingly imbalanced and possessed by the darker aspects of the planet. If an individual can balance these energies, they will pass into a higher level of spiritual initiation in the cosmos. Now that we understand that there is an imbalanced and regressive stream of Mars, or Martian stream, what exactly does that look like? How would that manifest in our world, and how would that manifest as an individual? So that Martian impulse, that regressive Martian impulse, is going to draw the individual and potentially even the world, if there are collective groups like this, into an intense materialist ideology. They're going to move towards scientism or dogmatic science, and their mind is always going to be, even if it is thinking in a spiritual way or wanting to perceive spirit or knows that spirit exists or that higher worlds exist, it's always grabbing the most obvious or literal interpretation of it. So the whole consciousness of the individual has a very hard time shifting into higher gears where the spiritual realms can actually be interacted with or understood. There's certain faculties that are not being developed when the mind functions in this way. So with this intense materialist ideology, science can actually become a religion. And the individual can begin looking into the material world for every single spiritual affirmation or every single thing about the spirits. And ironically and strangely, the spiritual world disappears as the scientific materialist, or someone who is possessed with this Martian impulse, is drawing so much on the material world, looking in the wrong direction, when they should be attuning themselves to actually perceive the spiritual planes. And because this doesn't work very well, and because no matter how much you distance yourself from the spiritual planes and your own spirit, you cannot get rid of the desire to have spiritual experience and to feel interconnected with other people and with the world and with the cosmos. You cannot delete that impulse and desire because it is so deeply a part of who we all are at our very basis. So instead, they seek to create machines and to try to use technology as a way to connect with these planes. Now, this is because, again, their consciousness is so degraded and materialized that they cannot connect to spiritual planes naturally anymore. They have not developed those faculties. But there is still this intense desire to have that connection. So they begin to create technologies and begin to put their focus on trying to use technologies in a ceremonial way. And of course, the other aspect of Mars can be intense egoism in a very negative way, intense selfishness. So that's a very bad combination, because there may not be that humility and humbleness that's actually that's actually needed in order to enter spiritual planes and have your spirit on fire inside of you. You do need that humbleness towards God and towards Christ. God, you need that in you in order to receive it, right? So this is a very toxic combination of qualities that Mars can stream into us if we're not at a stage of overcoming that impulse or transforming that impulse into its higher nature. Another thing that can happen with the Mars impulse that we can see in our society today is hyperfuturism. So when Mars becomes heightened and imbalanced and inverted, it will push society and try to push the individual to a hyper-futuristic society. So it's sort of like the emotional side of things, the spiritual side of things, and of course the feminine side of things is pushed aside, and it's made to seem weak. And it's all about technological advancement and advancing at any cost. And even, of course, with Mars being associated with conflict and might is right and battles, it's inevitable to become super hyper-futuristic, because their enemy will create this technology and they have to beat their enemy. So you kind of get down this intense Martian impulse of might is right and battles, and it ends up leading humanity into a stage of futurism and hyper-technological society when humanity actually isn't spiritually ready for that. They're not emotionally ready for that. There's a whole part of development that has not taken place because Martian impulse has entered humanity and entered society in such an intense way that it's pushing the technological advancement of humanity to a point where it can lead to destruction. So this is the danger of that Mars impulse is hyper-futurism, which isn't even really an advanced future. It's actually a completely degenerate future because it's not rooted in balance. It's rooted in the masculine impulse being inverted and turned up way too high in various individuals and groups on the planet. This, of course, leads to transhumanism. Okay, so eventually what ends up happening is they spiritualize technology to the point where they eventually have to merge with technology. So the issue is that they create these religions around technology. They use technology for spirit communication, for predictions, even potentially to mind upload or merge parts of themselves with or absorb people with. And then eventually the spirit, all spirituality and all of that essence has been channeled into machines, and they're just totally empty. They've invested so much in this external technology that eventually there's no choice but to merge with it. And this is why you see this intense push towards transhumanism, is that eventually when you invest so much into a machine, you eventually have to merge with that machine. If the machine becomes the thing that communicates with spirit and thins the veil and communicates with other planes, like with particle acceleration and all these different things, and eventually you've got to merge with the machine, because they're not learning how to do these processes from within their own being, right? They're trying to do all of these psychic processes and develop all these traditional cities or psychic powers outside of themselves through machines. So they have no other future but to merge with machines. And this is very sick because this also begins to change the form of humanity into something that is no longer human, right? So this is not a healthy way to be. So
inch away from the device, and this is sort of what it looks like. So. Yeah. This is our little device. That thing at the bottom is just to hold the threads in place because they're just like little fine wires. I mean, frankly, to sort of simplify this, what we're, I mean, it's more complicated than this, but it's, in a lot of ways, it's kind of like a Fitbit in your skull with tiny wires. So this is our surgical robot. And we actually ultimately want this robot to do essentially the entire surgery. So in everything from incision, removing the skull, inserting the electrodes, placing the device, and then closing things up and having you ready to leave. So we want to have a fully automated system. So this shows you at sort of close-up view, which I think is actually not too gruesome.
And it goes to say as well that the transhumanist society and the society that is crafted around these groups of individuals that are essentially possessed by the regressive Mars impulse, this is a society without heart. There is no heart. There is no compassion. There is none of that. It is just might is right. And if I can dominate you, then you deserve whatever that you get. So we have to understand what this impulse is so that we can deal with it correctly. So the next thing that happens when the Martian impulse becomes too regressed and intense in society, obviously, is that it tries to destroy the feminine impulse. It tries to destroy women and dominate women and control anything that has to do with the feminine impulse on the earth. And this is because in occult science, each polarity is balanced and humbled by the other. This is just how it is. And, it is the feminine principle that is the balancing principle for the masculine. And not even in the sense of an external thing, it's within us. So it's also the other way around, in that it's the feminine, it's the masculine impulse that clarifies the feminine. So the feminine impulse can become too emotional, too sensitive, too interconnected with everything and everyone to be reasonable. And it is the masculine impulse within the individual that brings clarity to that allows them to have a healthy separation and boundaries and an individuality, okay? And just like with the masculine impulse, it is the feminine impulse that goes into the masculine essence and says, you need to be more compassionate, you need to be more, you need to think of others. And so they really work together in this holy way. It's love and wisdom. It is the mother, the father, the male and the female. It is these polarities that are so, so, so important in our society, within ourselves, that we understand and use properly. And so it's actually a very important part of dark agendas to mix up these polarities and to not have them be able to be understood properly, so that we can seek balance in ourselves and ultimately within the world to evolve properly. So the issue with the Mars impulse, the regressive Mars impulse that exists within many groups, many powerful groups in the world, is that they refuse to balance themselves out. They're obsessed and they're possessed by this lower impulse, and within their mindset to, look and become balanced. Because when the feminine comes forward, it asks you to look at yourself. Just like when the masculine comes forward, if the feminine's in balance, it asks you to look at yourself. The other polarity humbles its partner, and it realigns them. And this can be very painful if you are not wanting to do that. It's not an easy process to integrate polarities, clearly. It's not easy to have to, listen to the other side, right? It's much easier to just try to prove it wrong and dominate it and get rid of it. And so this is actually what we're going to see more of in our society because of this regressive Mars impulse, is we're going to see this impulse to dominate and destroy the feminine principle in society, on Earth. And this is not a new impulse for the planet. It's something that we've always had to sort of keep at bay. And because I know that there's people that are very sensitive to the imbalanced feminine, which also does exist, I'll also add here that there were times on the planet where it was the opposite, where the Earth was ruled more so by Venus and streams from Venus, and the feminine did try to also keep the male at an infantile level and keep everything at a very infantile level so that she could dominate. So this is not a matter of, going back and forth here on which polarity is worse when it's imbalanced. The reality is that our epoch is more ruled by Mars at this time, and there will be serious efforts to get rid of women and to actually use science and use technology to take the role of women away in society. And we can see this very clearly already happening. So